In 1948, a Japanese-American man named Takashi Joe Masumoto walked onto 40 acres of grape and stone fruit land just outside Fresno, California, and signed his name to the deed. It should have been an ordinary moment, a farmer buying a farm. But 6 years earlier, that same man had been loaded onto a train at gunpoint, stripped of everything he owned, and sent to live behind barbed wire in the Arizona desert for the crime of having a Japanese face during a war with Japan. This is a true story. The names are real. The farm is still there, and it's still run by his family today. Before I get into it, this channel exists to tell the stories that history skips over, the forgotten farmers, the families who lost everything and built it back anyway. If that's the kind of story you want more of, hit subscribe, because there are more coming. Now let me take you back to the summer of 1942. The Masumoto and Sugimoto families had been farming the land around Fresno and Selma for decades. They weren't wealthy. They were farm workers, laborers who rented ground from white landowners and grew grapes, peaches, and plums on land they'd never be allowed to own. That wasn't an accident. California's alien land law, passed in 1913 and tightened in the years after, made it illegal for Japanese immigrants to buy property in the state. So families like the Masumotos farmed someone else's dirt season after season and waited for their American-born children to grow old enough to put a deed in their name instead. By the early 1940s, that patience was starting to pay off. Japanese-American farmers had built something remarkable in California. They were farming over 200,000 acres and growing nearly a third of the state's produce. The Masumotos were finally saving toward land of their own. Brothers and sons were lining up to farm together. It looked for the first time like it might actually happen. Then came December 7th, 1941. 2 months later, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Every person of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast, citizen or not, ally or not, guilty of nothing, was ordered out. The Masumotos had weeks to sell what they could and pack what they could carry. Everything else, they simply lost. It got worse before they even left. The family didn't own the land they farmed, they rented it. And their landlord, smelling opportunity instead of tragedy, offered them pennies on the dollar for their standing crop and then evicted them a week before their forced removal even began, just so he could bring in new renters faster. The family that had worked that soil for years was put out of their own home before the government even came for them. With nowhere to go, the family's patriarch walked to a neighboring farm and asked for help. The neighbor was poor, too, and apologized that all he had to offer was a barn. They took it. A barn was shelter, and in the summer of 1942, shelter from people who wanted you gone was not nothing. Not every neighbor turned away. Nearby, in the town of Fowler, a Japanese-American family named the Hiyamas struck a handshake deal with a local farmer named Cam Oliver to look after their vineyard while they were gone. Oliver took plenty of grief for it. Neighbors called him a Jap lover and a traitor to his face. He ignored every word of it. For years he tended that vineyard like it was his own, and mailed the Hiyamas their share of the raisin harvest, sending checks all the way to the Arizona desert until the family finally came home. At one point he even drove out there himself just to see them. The Masumotos weren't as lucky. They had no protector, no neighbor watching their back. By August of 1942, the family and the related Sugimoto family were loaded onto trains and sent to the Gila River War Relocation Center, a prison camp built on Gila River Indian community land in the Arizona desert, land the U.S. government had seized from the tribe without their consent to build it. The Masumotos would live there, behind barbed wire and guard towers for the next 4 years. They left as farmers with a plan. They arrived as prisoners, with nothing. Life at Gila River was bleak, but it wasn't empty. Thousands of farmers were suddenly locked in a patch of Arizona desert with nothing to do. So they did the only thing they knew how to do. They farmed it. Internees at Gila River grew so much food that they fed not just their own camp, but shipped surplus crops to other relocation camps across the country. Men and women who'd been told they were too dangerous to live near a coastline were quietly keeping 10 different prison camps fed. A young woman named Carol Sugimoto finished high school inside that camp, graduating from Canal High, a fully accredited school that existed only because thousands of American teenagers had nowhere else to go. It was at Gila River that she met a young man from a nearby family, Takashi Joe Masumoto. They would marry there, prisoners marrying prisoners, building a life inside a fence. Meanwhile, back in Fresno, the local farm bureau, the same agricultural establishment that had just watched its Japanese-American neighbors get dragged away, found something to object to. Not the injustice of it, the timing. Newspapers from the era show local farm officials complaining that the internment should be delayed because they still needed Japanese-American labor to finish bringing in the raisin harvest first. The crops mattered. The people growing them did not. The camp closed in late 1945. The Masumotos and Sugimotos walked out with almost nothing. No land, no equipment, no home to return to, just whatever they could carry, and whatever they'd managed to save from camp wages that paid pennies a day. In 1948, Joe Masumoto married Carol Sugimoto, and against her own better judgment by her family's own account, she thought it was a terrible risk. Joe spent what savings they had on 40 acres outside Fresno. It wasn't good land. It was full of grapevines, stone fruit trees, and a lot of hard, unworked clay underneath. But it was theirs. For the first time in the family's history in America, the dirt under their feet had their name on the deed. They moved in, caring for Joe's aging parents, Hikozo and Suwa, while building a farm and a family at the same time. 3 children were born on that land. They bought an adjoining 40 acres from a neighboring family, the Rifles, bringing the farm to 80 acres total, the same 80 acres that, in one form or another, the family still farms today. In 1968, they planted something that would change everything, a stone fruit variety called the Suncrest peach. Joe and Carol's son David, everyone calls him Mas, grew up resenting the farm. He was a teenager who planted peach trees with his father and hated every minute of it. He said himself his rows were crooked because he was too impatient to plant them straight. He left for UC Berkeley to study sociology, then traveled to Japan and spent months living and working on his own grandparents' old rice farm outside Kumamoto, the same village his grandmother had left 50 years earlier and never seen again. It was there, oddly, that he realized he wasn't Japanese. He was Japanese-American. And that realization is what pulled him back to Fresno. He returned to the family farm, got a master's degree at UC Davis, met his wife Marcy there, and together they bought 40 acres from his father to start farming on their own. Then, in 1987, the Suncrest peach, the variety his father had planted in 1968, the one Mas had grown up on, hit a wall. The big commercial buyers didn't want it anymore. It didn't ship well, it bruised easily. It didn't look as shiny as the newer varieties bred for supermarket shelves. It tasted incredible. It just wasn't profitable. Mas seriously considered bulldozing the orchard. Instead, he wrote about it. He wrote an essay called Epitaph for a Peach, a eulogy basically for a fruit that tasted like a peach is supposed to taste. He sent it to the Los Angeles Times almost as an afterthought. They ran it. It got syndicated nationally. Letters started arriving at the farm from total strangers in Ohio, North Carolina, places that had never heard of Delray, California. The message was the same every time. Don't you dare cut those trees down. His wife Marcy had a steady job at a hospital and later at Fresno State. Income that gave Mas the room to gamble on keeping the orchard instead of replacing it with something more profitable. He kept it. By the 1990s, the Masumoto family farm was selling its peaches to Chez Panisse, the restaurant that more or less invented modern American farm-to-table cooking. The Suncrest peach that almost got bulldozed ended up listed in Slow Food's Ark of Taste, a registry of foods considered too important to lose. Joe Masumoto died having spent his whole life rebuilding what was taken from him in a single summer in 1942. He never got an apology from the government that imprisoned him. Not really. Not one that meant anything financial until 1988, decades later, when Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act and the United States formally apologized for internment, offering surviving internees $20,000 each in reparations. It was not close to enough. It was something. Mas and Marcy's daughter, Nikiko, grew up on that same land. In 2006, she visited the site of her grandmother's incarceration and watched her grandmother participate in a second high school graduation ceremony, decades after the first one inside camp had been taken from her by history. Nikiko later performed a one-woman show about her family's internment story called What We Could Carry, and in December 2016 she performed it at the White House. A fourth-generation Japanese American, standing in the building that represents the government, telling the story of the grandparents that government once locked away. Today, Nikiko works the farm alongside her father. The Suncrest peaches still grow on trees planted by a teenager who hated farming and planted his rows crooked because he couldn't wait to be done. The 80 acres Joe Masumoto bought in 1948, against his wife's better judgment, with savings scraped together after 4 years behind barbed wire, are still producing some of the most sought-after peaches in California. Cam Oliver, the farmer who weathered being called a traitor just to keep a neighbor's vineyard alive, was telling that story decades later, unprompted, because it was the right thing to do, and he never stopped believing that. Nobody ever apologized to the Masumoto family for the landlord who evicted them a week early to squeeze out one more season of profit. Nobody ever apologized for a farm bureau that cared more about the raisin harvest than the people harvesting it. That's not how this story ends in a tidy bow. Some of that injustice just sits there, undocumented, unresolved, the way most real history does. What the family got instead wasn't an apology. It was the dirt. 40 acres, then 80, planted by hand, replanted by a son who almost gave up on it, carried forward by a granddaughter performing their story in the White House. That's the whole story. A family who arrived in a desert prison with nothing and decided the only answer was to go back to the one thing nobody could legislate away from them twice: the ground and the willingness to work it. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There are more like it. Drop a comment and tell me what your family rebuilt after losing everything. And if you know someone who needed to hear that the dirt is still worth something, send them this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.